A lot of what people talk about and teach under the label of processing emotions is actually just avoiding emotions in different flavors. And this leads to the problem where we get emotionally burdened. We get like emotionally clogged up. And it's a funny thing, isn't it? Like I've had emotions all my life and nobody ever taught me how to handle them, how to deal with them in a healthy way. I had to discover this myself. But having said that, everybody learns some rules around emotions, right? We all have to deal with emotions. Every culture, every religion, every society has stories and rules about what to do with emotions. And unfortunately, many of them are not very helpful, at least not if what you'd like to do is, be happy and feel good and avoid suffering. So what I want to do here is I want to unpack what I've personally discovered on this, which is completely life-changing. And I have no idea if I'm capable of communicating this in a way that, gets my points across and has the same effect on you. But that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that what I'm going to tell you here is life-changing for you too. So let's get right into it. The way to think about emotions is that an emotion is like a box that comes along on a conveyor belt. And imagine that you're sitting in front of one of these circular conveyor belts in a sushi restaurant. And so a little box comes along, that's an emotion. And now the question is what you do with it. Because first of all, let's take this frame and let's not go into, I'm not going to go into, to what extent are you the cause of your own emotions? Maybe a future episode. But let's consider that most of the time an emotion comes along and it doesn't feel like you made a choice about that, right? Something happens, maybe you get that text message and it triggers fear or sadness or something, right? An emotion just comes along. So now the question is what to do with it. Now there are many stories that we are kind of taught as children through culture and so on about what to do. And many of them are very, very unhelpful. So for example, one story about emotions that's very common is essentially about judging the emotions as good and bad and attaching judgment to the person feeling the emotion. So for example, boys don't cry, right? This is the idea, or real men don't cry, where the idea is like, okay, if you're feeling sad, but you happen to be male, then you better not express that sadness with tears. And if you do, that makes you weak and pathetic and whatever. And there can be whole stories about this, that even among adults, there can be stories about this where it's like, well, I can't trust a man if he cries, except, if that would be like a typical, maybe alpha male type idea, right? I can't trust a man who cries. But then usually there's some exceptions. What if my child died in my arms or something? I said, well, okay, I guess that's an exception. You're allowed to cry then. So then there's almost like a list. There's a very short list of these are the circumstances under which it's acceptable for a man to cry. And if you cry outside of these circumstances, then you're not trustworthy. And, somehow maybe I can't respect you. I can't work with you. I can't trust you, right? So that would be an example where we're making rules about emotions and we're attaching judgment to emotions. And so then what happens, and this is a very male-centric example I just gave, but funnily enough, I think with women, it's kind of similar because on the one hand, there's the expectation that women are more emotional. But on the other hand, they're also judged for it. Oh, don't be too emotional, right? So also kind of you're judged for it, maybe a bit less, but it's kind of accepted, but also not. And that's just an example where in implicit ways, we've gotten ideas about what is acceptable, what emotions should we feel, what emotions shouldn't we feel, what emotions are we allowed to express, and in what ways and in what circumstances. And in some cases, like in a religious context, for example, this might be even more explicit where you say, look, certain emotions, feelings, thoughts, impulses are sinful and bad. And so if you have a lustful emotion or a angry emotion or an envious emotion or something like that, that is sinful by itself. That's already bad. And also, who are you? You must be a sinner. There must be something wrong with you. So you better not feel this. And if you do feel it, because again, this stuff just comes along, right? Most of the time we don't make a choice to be like, okay, I'm going to be vengeful now, or I'm going to be lustful now. It happens. And so if we have these judgments attached to it, if you then tell yourself, if people knew that I am feeling this way, then they would ostracize me or disrespect me, or I would lose status or whatever. So now it puts you in a situation where you have to, on the one hand, pretend like your inner world is not what it is. And on the other hand, also possibly try and talk yourself out of feeling the emotion. So when one of these emotions comes along, that basically the box comes along on the conveyor belt and you go, uh-oh, this is one of those bad emotions and I'm a bad person for having this emotion. So now it's in my interest to externally pretend like this emotion isn't here, maybe cover it up. Haha, no, this is not sadness. Don't worry about it, right? And also internally, like I don't want to have the cognitive dissonance of feeling like a fraud, hiding my true self from people. So maybe I'm even trying to convince myself, no, this is not sadness. Don't look, ignore it. Hopefully it goes away. So this, I think, is one of the most suffering creating and tension building ways to deal with emotion is it creates a fear of emotion, right? The emotion box, whatever box comes along, right? The anger box, the sadness box, the grief box, the overwhelming confusion box, whatever it is comes along and you go, uh-oh, this is one of those I'm not allowed to express, I'm not allowed to feel. So now I'm trying to pretend like it's not here. I'm trying to maybe cover it up with a different emotion. I'm trying to force a different emotion than the one that's coming along. And I am essentially engaged in this inner conflict, and it adds additional emotions. Basically, now I'm afraid. I'm afraid of this emotion. So, the sadness box comes along, and I'm placing a fear box next to it, right? Because I'm afraid of sadness. And I'm also afraid of what if the next time sadness comes along, I'm afraid of the possible next instance. What I'm not doing is I'm not processing or expressing the emotion in a healthy way. And remember, this is one of those sushi restaurant type conveyor belts where the emotion comes along. I have all these reactions and judgments to it. I tense up about it, but I'm not doing anything with that box really. And so I'm just sending it for another go around. And this is a key idea in this analogy of the box on the conveyor belt. You can, and don't believe me here, I think you can examine this in your own life. Isn't it true that this stuff always comes around? That when you try to suppress or deny or pretend like it didn't happen, when you don't deal with the sadness, let's say, and so you don't take the box off the conveyor belt, you don't do anything with it, you try to deny it, you try to ignore it, it always comes around again. Maybe the next day, maybe weeks later, whatever, but that box always comes around again. And this is, again, that's my experience. My experience is that's very, very true. And it is something that, if anything, if you add the kind of fear response, like, oh no, I can't have this emotion, I can't deal with this, that makes it even more likely that it comes, or it makes it come around faster, if anything. So trying to push it away or ignore it or deny it or repress it, basically that never works, does it? Anyway, in my experience of my life, that never works. That only makes the emotion come around more. Now, this is also where the analogy tells us something about like why would we want to process these emotions? I think what happens is that if we don't process emotions, they keep coming around on the conveyor belt. Plus, life circumstances and whatnot add new emotions onto the conveyor belt, and we don't process any of them. We become burdened, right? We become like clogged up. Eventually, the conveyor belt is full of these emotions that you'd rather not fear, and you're constantly engaged in trying to deny them or ignore them or trying to manage, I can't show how sad I am, I can't show how confused I am or whatever, right? Because you're never taking boxes off the conveyor belt and new ones are being added. The whole thing just becomes cluttered up. And your whole life becomes about like managing all these overwhelming emotions that you don't know how to deal with, right? So this is also, and I think, again, this is true from experience. I feel like I've definitely felt this where the more I try to get rid of emotions, repress them and so on, the more dominated by emotions my life becomes. I think a clear example of this is the typical problem where you're not dealing with whatever emotions are coming up, and you know that you can keep yourself busy during the day. You can keep yourself busy and keep yourself occupied, keep your mind off of these things, but then you dread the quiet hours of the evening when you've done all the things, when there's nothing else to do but go to bed, and now you're lying in bed and it's dark and it's quiet, and oh no, here come all these feelings and thoughts rushing in, and I can't distract myself from them. And I would say that this is one of the reasons why people are numbing themselves so much, right? We're trying to numb ourselves to the emotions, and we do that by distracting ourselves. We do that also by consuming stuff that has a numbing effect. So consuming certain forms of media, consuming sugary foods, that's one that definitely is, a go-to for me. Like if I feel emotions that I'm not trying to feel, or if I'm trying to avoid stress, difficult situations, and so on, I always have the impulse to go for sugary food. That's somehow numbing, right? And other addictive substances. But then also, directly, I think people are numbing themselves. Again, that dreaded quiet evening time. It's like, how can I knock myself out with sleeping pills? How can I maybe take some substances that calm me down? And then in the morning, I take substances to wake myself up again, and then keep myself busy and not paying attention or not having to deal with all these difficult emotions all day. And we get stuck on a cycle, which I think the proof is in the pudding. This leads to nothing good. Again, long term, this doesn't work, right? Now, okay, this is one thing. Like I said, I think this is probably one of the worst things to do. And this is also my attempt to explain essentially emotional burdening. It can become really heavy. It can become really heavy to try and deal with all this stuff. My personal experience was also that I felt like I was too sensitive to deal with a lot of stuff, and I became very numb. And it's almost like I was unresponsive, unreactive to the world. But that numbness is also tense, and it costs energy. It makes one rigid, and it is difficult to maintain. And it's also a feeling. The numbness is also a feeling that you ultimately have to deal with somehow. Now, there's also another side to this, which is maybe a more modern appearance, which is putting emotions on a pedestal or reifying emotions. Now, this really became clear to me when I was reading Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier, which is a book about I only know this from this book, right? I don't know how accurate it is, but the book depicts a situation with the education of children, the educational landscape that children find themselves in, being kind of taken over by a lot of therapy speak and therapy ideas. And so children are essentially being taught to take emotions extremely seriously. And the focus is, of course, primarily on bad emotions and how everything is traumatizing and everyone is traumatized. And so you have teachers doing like pseudo-therapeutic stuff with kids. So kids are sitting around, talking about their feelings. Again, talking about generally bad experiences, trauma, and this kind of stuff. Encouraged to share this stuff in what should be, a math class, or they should be learning to read and write, but that's what they're doing instead. And the way this book lays it out, of course, makes it seem like absolute pandemonium. It's probably a bit exaggerated. I'm sure it's not like that in many parts of the world, but it's interesting to see that this is from the wish to be positive and trauma-informed and sensitive and whatnot. It can also swing too far the other way, where now we are making emotions this big, important thing that's central to life. And like I said, everything is treated as traumatizing. Everyone is traumatized. Everyone has a long list of, here are my mental health conditions. We must avoid triggering people at all costs. If you get triggered and you feel these traumatizing feelings, then that's a good enough reason to not go to school, for example, right? This kind of stuff. And this is ultimately also avoiding emotions. This is also avoiding the processing of emotions. And it has this added effect of like turning it into a performance and making it part of your identity. So now it's like these these whatever you associate certain memories with, okay, I have this kind of trauma and I have these kinds of mental health conditions and this is part of who I am and I'm constantly talking about it and I'm reenacting, reconfirming how important and dangerous these bad emotions are and how traumatized and how much of a victim I am through reiterating the same stories over and over again, which is also not processing the emotions. Rather, the emotions, certain emotions come along and you now attach a label to it, right? You go, oh yes, this is me. I'm identified with it, right? My conveyor belt, it's almost like the emotions that keep going around and around on my conveyor belt again and again. That's my identity. That's who I am. And I'm a victim of all this stuff. But again, you're not taking the boxes off the conveyor belt. You're just somehow over-identifying with what's happening on the emotional conveyor belt. That is also not useful and not helpful. And I'm afraid, again, if this book, Bad Therapy, is accurate, if this kind of thing is happening to the degree that the book suggests, then I'm afraid we're going to see some really dramatic fallout in terms of negative outcomes in people's lives. So that doesn't work either. Now, the other thing is, though, there is also, in certain circles, there's a lot of talk about processing emotions. Processing emotions, and there's many ways to do this. And in my experience, a lot of what people call processing emotions is also not actually processing the emotions. It's just avoiding the emotions with extra steps. So here's what I mean. One of them would be, okay, like talk therapy, right? A lot of talk therapy, and by the way, I'm going to give a bunch of examples that I'm sure will make some people mad. I'm not saying that all talk therapy is bad, okay? But I do believe that a lot of talk therapy, again, is in the reifying emotions kind of bracket and ends up adding too much identifying and too much thinking and storytelling and so on, none of which is processing. But also then what about things like, what's become more popular lately is things like breathwork and nervous system regulation, which, yes, that is a very interesting tool. We can use our breath to change our state on the level of the nervous system, which right away holds some promise where it's almost like you're going to the root, you're going more directly than through the mind and through language and through talking. And so the idea is, okay, here comes the difficult emotion like anxiety, fear, whatever. And now I can do some breath work. I can do this breath work exercise to calm myself down and to regulate my nervous system. And this is correct, but that's just a way to deal with the coming around of the box. So here comes the anxiety box or the sadness box. I don't want to deal with that. I'm afraid of it. It activates my nervous system. I have a response to it. And essentially, it's almost like I'm adding a fear box onto the conveyor belt. Now I'm doing breath work to get rid of the fear box again, while the anxiety box or the sadness box passes. The original emotion is still on the conveyor belt. And I would again say that the proof is in the pudding. If you keep doing this, I bet that the same emotions that you're breath working away keep coming around, right? So, and another one would be somatic processing of various kinds. So it's like you're jumping, you're shouting, you're shaking, you're screaming into a pillow, you're punching a pillow, stuff like that. Again, this will help change the state of your nervous system. But I would argue that in most cases, you're not processing the emotion because some emotion is coming along, sadness, loneliness, existential dread, whatever it is. You don't want to feel that. And now you're shaking and punching and screaming and whatnot. What are you actually doing is, again, you're processing and expressing your frustration about the emotion and the anger at yourself having this emotion that you don't want to have. And that leads to some kind of relief. But again, I bet that box keeps coming around the conveyor belt. And then you end up getting into a habit of shaking and screaming and shouting often. So with this type of processing, this is what I mean by this is just avoiding the emotion with extra steps, which isn't to say that this is all bad or you should never do it. This can be a really good coping strategy, right? If you just go, uh-oh, here comes something that feels totally overwhelming, and I know I can do this breath work to get myself in a state where I'm not going to panic, I'm not going to have an anxiety attack and I'm going to be able to continue to function in the world as I need to, that's great. It's a coping strategy, a survival strategy, basically. Fantastic. But let's not mistake that for actually processing the emotions in a useful way. So, what actually works? In my experience, there's only one thing. There's many paths to this thing, but there's only one thing that actually works. If you don't want the same emotions to keep coming around, if you don't want to be stuck in the same loops over and over again, you have to, when the box comes around, you have to take it off the conveyor belt and open the box. Okay? So the sadness box comes along, you take that box and you open it up. That is how processing works. Now, okay, how do you open the box? How do you actually do that? Let me give you an example of what this looked like. As I was learning this is a couple of years ago where I was still relatively new to this, but I was discovering this way of dealing with emotions. So it was a typical day, it was a Wednesday, and I got up, but already in the morning I wasn't feeling great. Okay, I was feeling like slightly depressed-ish. Just not a great day, right? But I was going about my work, and as I was going about my day, I just felt this, it almost felt like something looming in the background. It's like there's this sadness, this something, it's just like, it just doesn't feel good. And I have a history of depression. So as a teenager, I was depressed for many years. And then also as an adult, I was severely depressed for over a year at one point. And so this feeling, what I can describe of it is almost like a very, very early sign of depression. It's just this kind of general grayness, just general dissatisfaction, right? But like a very, very mild form of it. That's what it felt like. And of course, because I know how bad depression is, I don't want any of that. So my impulse, my original impulse is to keep myself busy and just ignore this thing and hope that it goes away, essentially. But at some point I noticed, hold on, this thing is really lurking in the back of my psyche. What's going on here? And I sat down and I started writing. So I started simply writing about, okay, here's what's going on. Here's what I'm feeling. And at first, and writing is just one of those things that really helps focus my mind on something. Right? It's a really good way of doing the opposite of avoiding this vague thing in the back of my mind. It's just like, okay, let's bring it into focus, to the forefront. Here's the feeling I'm having. And then I started writing about it, and often what happens in the process of writing is maybe more stuff comes up, like suddenly some memory comes up, or I realize what I'm actually feeling so dreadful about or whatever. But in this case, after a relatively short amount of writing, I realized, hold on, this is not one of those situations where I have to like unpack this and understand what's going on or anything like that. This is really just, the reality is this feeling is coming along on the conveyor belt. And what if I just feel it? And that's what I did. So I stopped writing and I just laid down. And I essentially, to open the box, what I do is I'm trying to not resist that emotion, right? The feeling that's coming up, I'm trying to simply not resist it. And this is like one of those indescribable internal motions that is quite hard to put into words, and probably everyone has their own way of doing it. But it's kind of an opening. One of the things that I think can be useful here is imagine that you're opening your heart. You're opening your heart to that feeling. And for me, it's also a feeling of relaxing. So letting go of the attempt to control this, letting go of the attempt to not feel this or ignore this or whatever. Just be like, okay, I'm just allowing this. I'm just allowing this thing to happen. And here's what happened. Very quickly, I just felt this overwhelming sadness, which wasn't connected to anything specific. So sometimes there's a very clear connection. I'm sad because X happened, right? But in this case, it was just sadness. I still don't know. To this day, I don't know what caused this, right? As far as I can tell, it's just like any other weekday, here comes a bunch of sadness for no reason. And so I opened myself up to this, and I felt very, very sad, and I started crying. And then, interestingly, about 30 seconds later, I stopped crying again, and it was just done. This was really surprising to me because it felt like here's this, endless torrent of sadness. But when I fully opened myself up to it, I was just like, okay, this is happening. It lasted for actually about 30 seconds. And I would say that I was very sad during those 30 seconds. And then it was just gone. And it was really like, okay, let's go and do something else. And it was like the moment it was done, it's almost like I couldn't quite remember what even had happened anymore. So before it was like this thing that was bothering me. Oh no, I don't want to, And then 30 seconds later, it's like, okay, that's done. And I went for a walk and had a great time. And for the rest of the day, I felt amazing. And so this lightness came afterwards, which also, this is an indicator here. The feeling of lightness and of completion that I feel when I open the box, when I process the emotion, is very, very different from the feeling of maybe relief and relaxation that you get when you breath work your way through a negative emotion, right? So for me, that's an indication that something else is going on there. That is an example of what it looks like to open the box. This is, interestingly, at least for me, I find this easiest to do with the most difficult emotions. So with something like grief, for example, I think grief is a great emotion to practice on because, first of all, if you're a human being, you're going to experience grief, right? You're going to experience loss. And grief is a very clean emotion. It's not a pleasant one. It's also not an unpleasant one. Maybe I'll say more about that later. But grief is a very clean emotion because you've experienced loss, which is a totally human thing. And you maybe there's a bunch of other stuff tied in there. Maybe you blame yourself for that loss or something, which is fine. Sometimes the case, sometimes not, right? But in any case, you experience loss and you feel this sadness, this grief. And it's just there to be felt. You're not supposed to not feel grief when you lose someone or when you experience another form of deep loss. You're supposed to feel sad. You're supposed to feel grief, right? So, and I think it's easier with grief to not judge ourselves for it. So if you tend to judge yourself a lot for your emotions, again, it might be a good one to practice. But also, it's very strong. If certain kinds of loss will hit really hard, and this emotion is going to be, it's not going to be a difficult thing. Oh, how do I open myself up to this emotion? It's like, no, here it is. Here it is, pressing itself onto your consciousness. It's very unambiguous, right? And there you can go, okay, I really don't want to, but what happens if I open myself up to this and allow myself to feel the grief? So this is something that, at least again, in my experience, that I started practicing on the most difficult, the heaviest emotions. And then I got better and better at it. And now I can do it with more subtle emotions as well. But for me, there was definitely a lot of sadness and grief and fear and loneliness and stuff like that I started processing in this way. Sometimes this stuff comes along for me based on something that happens, right? Something triggers the emotion. Often it seems to come out of nowhere. And sometimes I deliberately invite it. So I might take an evening and, maybe put on some quiet music and dim the lights and just lie down and be like, okay, let's see what wants to come up. Is there anything that needs to be felt that I haven't allowed myself to feel? And more often than not, something comes up. And what I've noticed, again, when I do this, first of all, I think the fear and the not wanting to do it I take that as a good sign, right? So you can almost think of, when it comes to the difficult feelings, sadness, grief, loneliness, existential dread, and so on, it's almost like fear is pointing the right direction, like a compass, because you go, I don't want to go there. I don't want to feel this. And it can feel overwhelming. But it's quite a clear indication. So for me, often it feels like the thing I need to do to open myself to this emotion, the thing I need to do in order to open the box, is basically do the thing I absolutely least want to do, the thing I'm most afraid of doing. It can be gut-wrenchingly hard for a moment to be like, I'm actually going to go there. I really don't want to. And then as the emotion comes on, for me, it's often a feeling of like almost, tipping over the top of the roller coaster. It's like, it's too late. And then I'm just in it. And again, I just let it happen. Quite often, the actual experience, and this is also, so while this is happening, so if the sadness or whatever it is that comes up, right, if you successfully open yourself up to it, then the next thing that I find useful to focus on is to just not resist, like to, as whatever is happening, to just try to focus on staying open to this and not resisting. Again, you're kind of on that roller coaster, and tensing up is not going to help. You might as well just relax and let it happen, right? That's how I try to relate to whatever then starts happening within me. And that can be, obviously, it can be crying, it can be things like that, but it can also be memories coming up and things like that. And it can also be just kind of stewing in very unpleasant feelings, like fear, just like sitting in the fear for a while. It's very unpleasant. You might not be crying, but you're not having a good time while it's happening. But I also find that the more I just allow myself to feel whatever is happening and almost be curious about what does this actually feel like and where and how do I feel this in my body, the more I do that, the more I find it hard to explain what is actually bad about the feeling. So a very interesting idea around this comes from a friend of mine who told me that she was talking to a therapist about anxiety. And at one point, she was going on about how, basically I can't handle it. The anxiety is too much. And her therapist told her, feel the anxiety and let it kill you. Okay, feel the anxiety and let it kill you, which I thought is a very interesting cue for fully opening up to the experience, because it's almost like these emotions suggest to us that we can't handle them. But if you go, okay, can I really not, like, can this thing kill me? Can this fear kill me? Can this sadness kill me? Can this bad emotion kill me? Actually, no. And maybe that's a good way to surrender to it, right? And my experience is the more I actually pay attention to the actual sensations of these emotions, the harder it is for me to explain what exactly is bad about them. So I find that sadness and grief, for example, or the actual experience of it, is there's something really beautiful about it. And I can't really think of these as negative emotions anymore. Now, this is also, I want to also address something here, which is sometimes we have good reasons to be afraid of certain emotional states. As I mentioned, I'm familiar with severe depression. I know that your mental/emotional state can be totally debilitating. And it can then also become existential. Like you can have rational reasons for fearing this. You can say, hey, if I fall into this state, I'm going to be unable to function in the world, and I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to lose my source of income because I can't work anymore. And then I can't pay rent, or I can't pay my mortgage or whatever. And you can kind of lay out a logical chain of events that says, if I allow this feeling to take over and I go into full-on depression, I end up in real serious trouble. And so you could maybe even say, yeah, it might kill me eventually, right? This chain of events might end up with me being dead. So I think we have, and this is especially true for really severe stuff and deep trauma, I'm not suggesting that the solution to every problem anyone has ever had is to just open yourself up to whatever emotions come along. I think sometimes we do really need, first of all, survival strategies, and we also need a lot of support and ways to like slowly process emotions. And there, things like therapy, things like the right kind of coaching, the right kind of somatic processing, things like plant medicine can be very, very helpful to get to the point, because some of these boxes you can't just open up, and I fully understand that. So I'm not suggesting that every single box or that this is the solution to everything, right? I think that what everyone can do is you can find the types of emotions that are basically not too big and not too small. Or at least what I mean by not too big, it's not one of those huge traumas, okay? That's one you can start with. For me, it's quite difficult. It was initially quite difficult to do this with subtle emotions. So finding something in between where it's like, okay, this is an emotion I don't want to feel, but I'm not like panicked about it too much, right? Finding the thing you can handle, and you can probably then work your way up to the more challenging, more sticky, more tricky emotions. So, okay, that is basically my experience of what it means to actually process emotions. And I think of this like the principle again. You accept that this emotion is coming along. You take the box off the conveyor belt. You open the box, and this can be done in many ways. So this can be done for me. Writing often has been a way to do that, where I go, okay, here comes this emotion. Let's write about it. Let's write about what's going on. What is this trying to tell me, or what am I neglecting in my life that makes this feeling come around again and again? And often processing emotion also, for me, is only complete once I take it out into the real world. Because a feeling box might come around and around and around. And what I really need to do is I need to stand up for myself, and I need to have this difficult conversation with someone who's walking all over me. And I can process the emotion as it comes around. But if I don't stand up for myself, if I don't take this thing into the real world, that person is still going to walk all over me. They're still going to, not respect my boundaries and so on. So then the box comes around again, right? So the mechanism of, if you don't properly deal with it, it comes around again, is true internally and also externally. Like the world will keep creating the same box for you over and over again until you do something about it. That's my experience, right? And especially for that, writing can sometimes be very, very useful. To be like, okay, what am I not doing? Why is this same pattern always happening to me? Why do I always end up in this type of conflict? It's like, like a relationship conflict. No matter who I'm with, I always end up in the same kind of conflict. What's going on? The same emotional boxes are always coming around. What do I need to do here? What do I need to do to change this? And writing has been super helpful for me to gain clarity about that. What I think is very important is that this is not following a strict pattern. So the processing of emotions doesn't follow a strict pattern, and it's not performative in any way. I think this is very, very important. We can easily get attached to basically, look how hard I'm sobbing, as a confirmation or a validation of the story of how much of a victim I am, or something like that. So again, this might be a topic for a separate episode, where it's like, I think there can be subtleties of, are you grasping onto certain parts of the experience? Do you really want this box to keep coming around? And are you essentially doing a certain kind of processing in order to avoid something else, right? But the idea here is, for me, authentic, real processing is often quite surprising. So I gave the example of the spontaneous crying that only lasted 30 seconds. That was quite surprising. It's not what I planned for. And another example of this, and maybe also an example of why I think why do all this to begin with, right? So an experience I had not too long ago was that same thing, random Wednesday of the week, nothing special was happening. And I was having the most normal day. And at some point, I am sitting on the couch reading, and I realize kind of a feeling come on, and I stop reading and I pay attention to it. So basically right away, I open myself to whatever is coming. And I realize that I'm just feeling really grateful. Again, not about anything in particular, not triggered by anything that happened that day. Just out of the blue, I start feeling grateful. And I open the box, and I get this feeling of overwhelming gratitude. Like I almost can't handle it. And I surrender to that feeling. And again, I'm crying. This time I'm crying like tears of joy, because I just can't take how amazing it is to be alive, and how grateful I am for everything that's happened to me, and how grateful I am to be alive in this moment, and so on. It's like almost too much. And that one lasted for like 5 minutes or longer. It lasted longer than I would have thought. And again, it came out of nowhere. So again, this wasn't some kind of a performative thing. And I do gratitude practice every day in writing, but this wasn't a planned thing. This wasn't based on anything. This was just feeling that feeling out of the blue. And I think that there are, in my experience, processing emotions in the way that I've described here has two effects. One of them is that you can take these boxes off the conveyor belt, and eventually they don't keep coming. So there are certain feelings that I didn't want to deal with and repressed for most of my life, where I felt stuck on a loop. And once I learned to actually process that emotion and actually allow that emotion, and in some cases also take some action based on essentially what that emotion was telling me. That led to an actual resolution of that loop, where now I'm like, no, I'm no longer stuck there, and it's not the same thing coming around over and over again. And so you're unburdening, so that the conveyor belt becomes uncluttered from all the old unprocessed stuff. When you process, it doesn't keep coming around. And I think that, just like I said, the example I gave, so there's this feeling of lightness and completion that comes with it, and just like peace of mind, quietness, like my default state is just much calmer and much more positive in general. And I think it has a lot to do with learning how to process stuff correctly. But the other thing is that also, I think many of us, or at least this was certainly true for me in the past, I think I had my conveyor belt of emotions cluttered up with lots and lots of difficult emotions, and my fear and numbness and response to those difficult emotions was like all cluttered up with this stuff, which means there wasn't a lot of room left for positive emotions. And I think that this kind of thing, like spontaneous, almost overwhelming gratitude, that coming out of nowhere is also a result of me just clearing off that conveyor belt. Because this kind of thing is happening to me more and more often lately. Not to that extent always, but I will just spontaneously, for no reason, feel amazing. And again, this never happened to me before. The only way to feel amazing before was I had to make stuff happen, right? I had to have things happen that would then make me feel good. Whereas now it's much more common for me to just, for no reason, out of the blue, feel amazing. And there too, I think it's worth considering, this idea of taking the box and opening it and not resisting what's inside. This applies to positive, pleasant emotions as well. I think we can all immediately relate to all the negative emotions you don't want to feel, all the unpleasant emotions that you repress and numb yourself to and run away from, right? But also ask yourself, like, to what extent do you allow yourself to feel joy and bliss and happiness and pleasure and things like that? And to what extent do you also have stories about this, where it's like, oh, well, this is too much, right? It's like, for whatever reason, maybe or I don't deserve this. I don't deserve this much happiness, I think, for example, your response to a compliment might tell you a lot about how you treat positive emotions. If you immediately deflect and basically tell people, no, don't say nice things to me, that might be an indication that that's also what you do with pleasant emotions that come around. It's like, no, I don't want to open this box. This is happiness and joy and bliss. No, that's not for me. I don't deserve that, right? I'm not a good enough person for that. And there, I think you're, again, instead of just taking the box and opening it and feeling the feeling, and it's great, you are adding more boxes onto the conveyor belt. Oh, no, I can't feel happiness. So, I feel self-judgment and this and that and the other. So even the positive emotions become something that create internal tension that you have to manage. So although I do have to say, maybe my analogy breaks down a little bit, I don't know if the positive emotion boxes come around as reliably as the negative emotion ones when you don't open them up. Let me tell you, let me know what your experience is with that. But anyway, that's something to consider, because even with pleasant emotions, I'm getting better at just going, oh, this feels great, and allowing that feeling to happen, and also not clinging to that feeling. Just like the negative emotions, it will pass no matter what. So not clinging to that and just feeling good while it lasts, and then that's fine. All right, this is my sushi conveyor belt box analogy of how to actually process emotions. Like I said in the beginning, the reason I'm talking about this is because it's one of those things that for some reason I wasn't taught. And I think a lot of the stories that we're told about how to do this end up backfiring, end up not giving us the results that we actually want. And my experience has been, so this reminds me a little bit of a Bruce Lee quote. I think it was a Bruce Lee quote. But anyway, or I heard him talk about it. He's one of the people who really influenced me when I was young. I heard him talk about this idea that mastery and progress is often not about adding stuff, adding more and more, but you're removing stuff. It's more like a sculpture where you're removing and refining more and more, right? And this is one of those things where I see a parallel here where it feels like the more I am able to process difficult feelings, the more I'm able to do this opening the box thing, the more it seems to clear things away, and it just creates lightness and an unburdening, which then it just opens up, potential for other stuff to happen. It just makes it easier for whatever the positive goals you have in your life. Just feeling good with yourself, but also, focusing, being a high performer, getting stuff done. My experience becomes easier and easier the more you unburden yourself from all this noise. My experience was very much that when I was younger, I had so much mental and emotional noise going on within me. I mean, incredible. I was just so tense, and there was so much negative self-talk going on in my head. I could barely get, a productive thought in edgewise. And that is one of the very clear advantages. Like, the more you go through these things, and interestingly, the more you're willing to experience these difficult emotions, the more it opens you up to feel good and to feel positive emotions more generally, and to basically have a better life, right? It feels like such a massive unlock to be able to do this. All right, that's the reason I'm talking about this. I really hope, and I'd love to hear back from you. I really hope that this makes sense, and I really hope that this is something you can put into practice. I would love to hear, if you try this out, I would love to hear from you about your experience with it, whether it works for you or if you get stuck on something. This has been such a huge benefit to my life. I really, really just want to get this into other people's hands. All right, on that note, as a final thing, I mentioned writing here a couple of times. Introspective writing has been really instrumental for me to even build the kind of awareness to be able to do all the stuff that I'm talking about. And it's often also an entry point for me to get to almost like, sometimes I can't quite reach the box, and sometimes writing helps me actually get the box and then open it up. And the actual experience of what happens when you open the box usually happens without any writing, just happens internally. But anyway, introspective writing is something I've talked about a lot. I've taught some of it in a past course, but I've never made like the introspective writing course. And I finally put myself in a position where I let people talk myself into making it, because a lot of people have already told me I should make that. So I'll also link below to a waitlist. If you want to learn introspective writing from me, you can get on my waitlist. If you're already on my newsletter, there's also, I'm going to send more about that in the future anyway. But anyway, just wanted to plug that as an emotional processing tool, writing. That is something I also want to teach. And if you're interested, get on that waitlist. All right, that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for listening. And I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions and feedback on this one.